Welcome to the Royal Automobile Club on London's swanky Pall Mall. I've come to this club to interview one of the people who perhaps means more than any other person so much to the thalidomide generation in the UK. Sir Harry Evans, as editor of the Northern Echo and then of the Sunday Times, did so much work to highlight the injustice that we and our families were experiencing, and single-handedly turned around the situation so that in the end the government and distillers were made to eat their words and give us something like a lasting settlement. Here in the Seagrave room, I'm surrounded by portraits of people like Sir Stirling Moss and brilliant paintings of some of the pivotal moments in motorsport, from Brooklands to Brands Hatch. Harry, thank you very much for agreeing to do the interview with us today. We're in auspicious surroundings, aren't we? We've got Stirling Moss on the wall, we've got photos of cars, Brooklands and other famous racing circuits, and just out of the window, we've got what?
Well, if you look out the window here, there's some railings, and I used to walk past them with a scowl every day. And the scowl was because that was the headquarters of Distillers, the liquor company that was the licensee for thalidomide, which was then called Distaval. And of course, that Distaval poisoned thousands. And so this is where the directors, who kept saying, no, we're not going to pay any compensation, we're not going to admit any liability. In that rather beautiful building, that's where they sat dispensing injustice.
Goodness. So it's highly symbolic for us.
It's very close to you, and and I just come here so often to my club, and to find this. And then there's a photograph in my book, I think, of one interesting thing about the photograph of the directors, who were all sitting around a long table, sin attacking the devil. And what's the distinctive thing about that boardroom? I would think there were probably 20 people around that boardroom. What's the distinctive thing about them? Think. This is a board of a major drug company, pharmaceutical and drinks company, mainly a drinks company, not a single woman. And that, of course, is symptomatic of most of the boardrooms, because most of the boardrooms in the United States and the United Kingdom are stuffed with troglodytes called males. So that's the distinction.
Let me take you back then and ask you, when did it first become apparent to you the scale of what you were dealing with the thalidomide disaster?
Well, the first inclination to me of the disaster was seeing the children at Chelly Hospital, which I put a photograph in the Northern Echo with sympathy, but didn't get much sympathy. People didn't like looking at it. The scale of the disaster really became apparent to me when I reached London and began to look more closely into what had happened in Germany and how it had spread around the world. And the scale of disaster was rather like looking through the right end of a telescope, because it suddenly became apparent that the cases I'd been obsessed with throughout Britain were about 200 odd, when I saw only a small part of it. And then, of course, the more I read about it and came to know about it, I realized it was an international disaster on a major scale, greater than anything that had gone before. Certainly greater than anything pharmaceutical, but greater than anything else, 100,000 babies. It blows the mind to think that two things stick in my mind about this. One, first of all, the scale of the disaster. And secondly, the profound and amazing ignorance of all the established people and commentators. The Times of London, the Scotsman, the Guardian, the Economist, BBC, every single one of them, all said, well, of course, the company had no idea at that time that the placental barrier could not stop a pharmaceutical from doing damage to a fetus. But of course, why did they say that? Because they're blockheads, okay? Blockheads. Not one of those commentators, not one, intelligent, best publications, etc., never thought, oh, I wonder if that's right. Yeah, of course. Yeah, how could it get past that piece of steel called the placenta? It blows the mind. When you think about the thalidomide disaster, you're faced with a multiple of sins. The sin of ignorance, when you actually have no right to be ignorant because you're going to affect somebody's life, lots of people's, thousands of people's lives. The sin of greed, why we can go on making money, we'll continue to publish and propagate this thing, and the sin of complacency among the press and everybody, and then the sin of superiority, that the law knows best and the law will take its course. The law, as Dickens said, was an ass, and it needed more than one stick to beat it. So if you want to, in a way, I have another title for this. This is the stealthiest crime ever committed, because it was carried out in ignorance, protected by stealth.
When you think back to something on that scale, how did you as an editor plan to deal with, something that big? How did you plan to cover it, first at the Northern Echo and then at the Sunday Times? I
couldn't have done a thing, really, without wonderful people around me on the newspaper. The enormity of the task was certainly great, especially since we weren't getting anywhere, and especially since every time we tried to find out what was going on, it was stopped by the law. So we have these documents, which I acquired, but we couldn't use them. Philip Knightley, the late Philip Knightley, took all the German documents, had them translated, then all the British documents had them translated, and they were like prisoners in some alien jail. They were locked in steel filing cabinets in the Sunday Times, but they couldn't get out. Their voices couldn't be heard because the law said it was sub judice. Can you just imagine this? Help, help! We have something to say. Shut up. You've nothing to say. The law has taken care of this. So that's the phantasmagoric nightmare of these being, imagining these were people, which is what they were. Those files, and they were people, because they all had names and things on. They were all people trying to be heard. All people being suppressed by an archaic law and supported by silence in the press and in Parliament. So you're right, it was a major, in fact, looking back on it, it's probably too scary to have attempted.
I mean, apparently Philip Knightley said that it would have been worth going to jail for the Thalidomide story. Do you think, in your long career as a journalist, there's anything that comes anywhere near as profound as that?
We could have launched a campaign for Thalidomide, which we did after Bruce Page had done the pharmaceutical work, and Phil, John Fielding, and others had assembled the papers. We could have said, to hell with the law. We will now going to publish what we know. Certainty of that would have been a trial for contempt of court, because we'd had one before, one incident of contempt of court, and very serious. So we've certainly been prosecuted, most likely gone to prison. End of the campaign. So one of the things was not to get yourself locked up like those victims in the little metal boxes. so that you couldn't do anything. So once we'd lost in the High Court, which we absolutely certainly would have done, we would have been finished as a campaigner. But the genius of James Evans, our lawyer on the case, and the luck we had, and the ingenuity of the journalists, was that we were able to open the prison door without being pushed back in. So in other words, we were able to start the campaign and say, look at these outrageous levels of settlement on these pages. Look how outrageous it is. Somebody born without legs and arms is expected to live on this because of the negligence of this drug company. And because the government has suppressed the information, look how appalling it is. And the idea that you would now put us in prison for this is so monstrous, because what are the means of ventilation of the grievances that left to us? Now, that only became possible because our lawyer, James Evans, my initial instinct was to publish a big article, one article, and then move on to the next. He said, don't do that. What you do is you publish the article, then you say, in a future article, we will. So we didn't say next week there will be this, we said in a future article. We put them on notice, the Attorney General, that we intended to continue. Whereupon, and they didn't immediately act against us, so we were able to do for a second week. And then, of course, we started legal proceedings in which they didn't prosecute us for what we'd done first, but kept warning us that we might break the law, so we kept on going further and further. And then, as you know, I mean, the interesting case, we got to the point where in all these exchanges, the Attorney General decided not to prosecute us for what we'd already published. That meant that Jack Ashley and Alf Morris in the House of Commons could get up on their feet and start saying things, which meant that all the Tory MPs could join in as they did. So we had, and that meant, hallelujah! Suddenly all the press can write about it.
So it's pretty clear to you that, but for the mass media, that it was only the role of the media and your particular role that saved me and my, survivors or whatever you want to call them, from the massive miscarriage of justice that was almost about to happen.
Yeah. Oh yeah, no question about it. To take the most optimistic thing that would have happened. Let's say, for instance, we run the campaign, but we get scared and we don't persist. Okay. The most optimistic thing would have happened would have been that some very, very low level of compensation would have been established, which would have made the lives of thalidomide people rather more miserable, a lot more miserable. But it would also have meant that a lot more cases would not have come to light. A lot more people a lot of thalidomide victims, half of them would have had no justice. I've said this before, but I'll say it again. You can't just publish the truth once. Publishing the truth once doesn't work. So eventually, the truth came out, but didn't come out from a single instance. Ditto, if in 1962, The Economist and somebody had said these drugs should have been tested before in pregnancy, that might have been a story. Oh, what a pity. No. But nothing would have happened without the campaign. The number of ways in which a single truth is defeated are incredible. The dissemination of the truth persistently so that it goes through and dawns on people, hey, those people in those little tin boxes, they're getting older and they've got no justice. That truth, then hammered home, then has an effect, because people, when they think about it and reflect on it, they do respond. And as we saw when the shareholders started agitating and the city started agitating, the MPs started agitating, none of that would have happened without a campaign.
Do you think the amount of publicity that thalidomide survivors, children as we then were, received, actually had an impact on the way disabled people per se are perceived in society?
Oh yeah, I think so. I mean, and there have been some heroes in this respect. I mean, George Herbert Walker Bush, established the first Disabled Act. People like Jack Ashley, Alf Morris. I think the atmosphere changed. I know that in 1961 or 2, when I published Thalidomide Children, I got attacked in the Northern Echo. Because why do we want to look at these people? They make us unhappy. Something changed. Something changed. I think instead of, if I might say so, disgust, about disgusting pictures, people began to realize the human predicament. And so once only one of those people got out of the tin box and turned out to be Geoff Adams, or who had a story to tell, and he was a human being and had a personality.
Let's just shift our attention to Germany for a second. Are you surprised by the way the German media failed to get behind its thalidomide population in the way that the British media did? I mean, and do you think that was responsible for the lack of justice in Germany?
Well, it took the British media quite a long time to. After we began the campaign, British media had to be satisfied we had the case. And then when we had the case, we had the support of people. And that's how the media came along. So they were a bit belated in Britain. I think that in Germany, the fact that the law had taken cognizance of the case, and there'd been the trial, the criminal trial, and there had been a award, which we happen to know was wholly inadequate, made that was actually kind of licking the envelope and putting it aside. That official closure to the case, the German judges have decided to suspend the trial for the benefit of the victims. There will be a fund established of XYZ. I said, so everybody thought, okay, that's it. Of course, that's not even beginnings of the truth. The beginning of the truth was the German trial was corruptly suspended. So the good question is, how come the German press, by and large, accepted a corrupt verdict? Once the law is seized of the matter and then unseizes it because they're satisfied, then everybody moves on. So it's a common thing. So it's very hard to reopen a scandal, to say, you know that 1960 thing? Oh, forget it, that's all. I mean, except in cases like the Titanic, they're still trying to find out what went wrong. This was the Titanic. The Thalidomide thing was the Titanic.
That campaigning, or you could call it investigative journalism of your Insight team, where do you see that kind of journalism happening now? Does it still exist?
Let's distinguish between the two. Investigative journalism finds the facts. You may find there are not enough facts to justify any further action, and you have to go into it with that in mind. The campaign is to take the result of that investigation and not allow it to remain as a single truth. The justification for not allowing it to remain as a single truth is that there is a remedy which is being denied. So you need those three elements to put together. So the question you're asking me, which is perfectly sensible, in my mind boils down to, is there enough investigative journalism? Why isn't there a campaign after the finding of a wrong? And thirdly, why do they fail or succeed? So we come to the three elements of that. I think, well, the conventional excuse is, one, investigating is expensive. Two, you sink a lot of holes in the ground, there's no coal at the bottom of it. So people get discouraged about that. Secondly, there is the forces of inertia and, a judge said it, so it must be right. It's very powerful in a society which basically conforms to certain images of authority. And then thirdly, there is, of course, the fact that it requires a great deal of skill and courage to do really investigative journalism. And it's much easier to listen to somebody on the phone. Oh, you had it off last night, did you? Ha, ha, ha. I happened to be at Daily Express listening to it. It's much easier to pursue individuals' personal life and privacy and make some kind of, quote, scandal out of it than it is to do the hard work of investigating things.
I want to wrap this up fairly soon, Harry, but I would like to ask you, as a final question, do you think that there is likely to be a feature film made about thalidomide, and if so, who would you like to play you in the film?
You mean a film star?
Who's worthy of the mantle?
Oh, anybody will do, really. It's somebody who exemplifies determination, but he doesn't have to be good looking because that would make my life more difficult. I don't particularly see myself as a film star.
Well, it's a very nice way to end the conversation, and I just want to say on behalf of all of the members of the Thalidomide Society, thank you so much for your support over so many years, and thank you for continuing to support the work of the Society and being our patron. Thank you very much.
No, there's only a simple answer, isn't it? It's an honour. Thank you.